Well, good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to this afternoon's BSI monthly built environment webinar. My name is Dan Rossiter. I'll introduce myself properly in a minute or two. Before we get started, I just wanted to take us through a little bit of housekeeping. If you've been to one of our webinars before, you'll know all of this. Sorry, bear with me 1 second. There seems to be a bit of static on the call. Dale, there we go, perfect. As is the way we're going live. So if you've been to one of our built environment webinars before, you'll know exactly how these things work. If you haven't, what this is a listen-only webinar that is being recorded. So this has a number of benefits to it. The first is that when we finish these webinars, they also go on demand onto the website. So you might have been able before to access some of our previous webinars, but if not, you'll be able to look at this one or be able to look at any of the other ones in our rolling stock on an array of topics. So this webinar itself is being recorded, and the way that you interact with us is through the Q&A function. So if you look on the side of your panel, go to webinar, you have the option to submit questions there. Those questions can be both technical, so if you have any technical difficulties, just send those through. For example, if the audio goes, or if you can't see the slides or anything like that, those sorts of questions, put them in the Q&A. At the same time, if you have technical questions about what's been presented today, things you might want to know more about, things that didn't sound right and you want clarifications on, submit those questions, and there's time at the end of the presentation where we will put our cameras back on and we'll go through both the pre-submitted questions as well as the questions that you present to us today. In terms of getting access to things like the slides, once the webinar is completed, you'll be sent back a feedback survey, and in completing the feedback survey, you'll get access to the recording of the webinar, access to the deck, as well as a certificate as well for if CPD hours to log those to. So hopefully that all sounds fairly straightforward. In which case then, what I'm going to do is briefly introduce our speakers by introducing myself first. So I'm Dan Rossiter, Built Environment Sector Lead, well, one of the Built Environment Sector Leads here at the British Standards Institute, as well as Vice President Technical for the Chartered Institute of Architectural Technologists. I'll talk a little later on about the standards overlay work we're doing as the person who's principally started to set it all up, but I'll talk through you and all of that a little later. What I'll do first is introduce our main speaker, which is Dale Sinclair. So Dale is a director and head of innovation at WSP, and also is obviously a member of the RIBA, and there's an awful lot of amount for them in the background. I can see you there, Dale. Nice to see you. Welcome aboard. And before you begin your presentation proper, why don't you tell everyone a little bit about yourself?
Yeah, thank you very much, Dan. Yeah, so I'm head of digital innovation for WSP. So spend my day job is really trying to look at new ways of designing and delivering projects. But for the purposes of this presentation, really representing the RIBA, I was the lead author for the RIBA Plan of Work 2013 and all the supporting documents that we'll show you in a second. And I also kind of offered the 2020 update. So delighted to be speaking to you today. And so the first thing to do is really give you a piece of backdate. Hold on a second. Next slide. Thanks. So as I've just said, the RIBA Plan of Work has been around for actually more than 50 years. So in 2013, when we did an update, that was actually the 50th anniversary of the RIBA Plan of Work. So it's now obviously been around for 60 years and it is the go-to kind of, if you like, process map for the industry. It's not for architects, it's for the whole construction industry. When we updated it in 2013, we did a number of publications. The one in red there was free to download, and the other two guidance notes were paid for. One of the problems RIBA found was that obviously if you ask someone to pay for something, you get less people downloading it. So one of the things that we did in 2020, next slide, is that we next slide.
So let's so Dale, if you click
Yeah.
on the screen, are
Yeah.
you able to? There you go.
Yeah, no, the slides are not moving on. So I'll just say next slide. So one of the things we did in 2020 was really to produce a more comprehensive overview, which is free to download. So if any of you have not downloaded that, it gives lots of comprehensive backup to the plan of work, what it's all about, what it does and how you should use it. Now, one of the differences you'll see in the 2020 version, there's more kind of boxes. So you'll see these dark gray boxes. So we didn't well, in fact, we didn't really make any changes to plan work in 2020. We spent most of the time writing supporting narrative to try and reinforce areas where the plan of work was not really being used as intended, and I'll come on to some of those topics as I go through this. So that was really the purpose in 2020. The major change in terms of the stages was that we changed stage 3 to spatial coordination, and we added manufacturing to stage 5 to recognize that we're shifting to a new kind of way of doing things. Next slide. And as I've already said, the whole purpose of the plan of work is to be for the project team, whether that's someone in the design team, the client team, or the construction team. And I guess one of the things that we were keen to do as part of this was to really begin to bring some clarity to who is in each team. So I'm frequently the lead designer of some major projects, and one of the challenges that we have is, for example, is the security consultant in the design team, or is the security consultant I'm speaking, working for the client. And as you can see here, we've got a security consultant in the design team and one in the client team. So really important to understand who you're working for as the lead designer and who's in the design team and who's actually designing as part of what they do. Next slide. And the other thing I would say about the plan of work is that we did do a mapping. So in the guidance document, you'll see a mapping against all the other plans of work in the world. So the RIBA plan of work is not unique globally. Most countries do have their own plan of work to bring some clarity to the stages. But what you'll see here is that where the RIBA plan of work is quite unique is that the stage 0 is unusual in other countries, and also you'll see that the post occupancy, the in use, is also quite unusual. So I would say that the RIBA plan of work is one of the few plans of work that looks at the whole life cycle of a project, which was obviously one of the intentions when it was updated in 2013. Next slide. And the other thing is that I've seen various comments recently. Well, of course, we're shifting to manufacturing or platforms, so the RIBA plan of work won't be relevant in the future. But I do believe that it will. I think it is robust into the future. I think we will see overlays for program approaches or platform approaches. But obviously, every project still needs to go through a briefing process, a design process, and a construction or manufacturing process. So I don't see any reason why the plan of work doesn't adapt and adjust to those scenarios in the future. Next slide. And one point just to kick off in terms of the horizontal bar. So obviously we've got the stages 0 to 7, the 8 stages of the plan of work. But the plan of work is really geared around some horizontal kind of taskbars, as we call them at the time. The one at the top is really recognizing that the design team that most of you will typically be part of doesn't really kick in until stage 1 to 6. And in actually many instances, the design team won't come on board until stage 2. Now, the reason we put that in is we saw a lot of appointment documents coming out with stage 0 and 7, but that's really for the client to be doing some additional work. And I'll come on to the reason for that in a second. If we can just press the next click. And of course, as we go through the horizontal bars, we've got the first one that was geared to outcomes, which actually made it a bit piffier than the previous version. The next one, so if I just click down, is about the core tasks. So obviously that's not all of the tasks that are necessary, but just giving you some of the key things that need to occur at each stage of a project. So next, can we just click again? Yeah, and then we've got the statutory processes, which was a new bar, really just recognizing that at each stage different statutory things need to be done for building regulations or for planning consent. And then the next one is the procurement route, and that really acknowledges that different procurement routes need different engagement. So in a sense, that procurement is taking content out of the different stages and using it for procurement. And if I'd gone back to the last slide, you'll see that a few countries still have procurement embedded into their plans of work, but of course, when you've got a number of procurement routes, that's not possible. And then the final bar on here is about information exchanges, and that really just sets out the major elements which are being obviously issued at each stage. So next slide. And a crucial thing is that the plan of work is never really intended to be a contractual document, which of course it can't be, because it doesn't actually, it's not a schedule of services. It's setting out the general thrust of activity. It's not setting out specifically what each person is doing, and just reinforcing it is pure procurement agnostic. So you maybe need to think about how procurement works with it. It's definitely enabled for BIM, and it needs to work alongside all the guidance documents that I've referenced from the start. Next slide. Now what I want to do is just walk you through each one of the different project stages. And of course, stage 0 is really about defining the best way of achieving the client requirements. And the example I like to give is if I own, let's say it could be a tech company, and I'm expanding very fast, and maybe I need some additional desk space. So at stage 0, the client may say, well, what's the best way of me achieving my, let's say, additional 100 desks? I can obviously do a space planning exercise. I could ask people to work from home. I might rent some ancillary space from a company. So there's lots of different ways of achieving my requirements. So stage 0 may not end up outputting into let's say a construction project. It might actually be that I just go away and I rent some desk space. And that's a really crucial thing about stage 0. It's about what is the best way for the client to get their requirements. Stage 0 is when you would compare different sites, but the main point about stage 0, it's a very strategic look at what is the best way for a client to achieve the requirements, whether that's looking at different solutions or different sites and so on. And of course, the business case is behind that, the project risks. I remember once I did a project where there was a 3-kilometer drainage kind of diversion required to make the site work, and it was on the edge about whether that actually would tip the project to not really be financially feasible. So that's really what stage 0 is about. It's that strategic definition. And of course, if a building project is deemed to be the most efficient way of achieving the client requirements, then next slide, we proceed into stage 1. So stage 1, now that we know that a building is the best way to achieve the client requirements, we need to develop a project brief. We need to look at a whole bunch of briefing topics. Now, whether that's the sustainability outcomes or what the quality aspirations are, we need to begin to build all that data. And of course, crucially, the spatial requirements become really important, because the area of a building has a close correlation to the next topic, which is the project budget. We obviously need to get some proper site information, which may in the past have been a topographical survey, but increasingly it becomes a point cloud survey. And we need to put together a program that sets out when each of the stages are taking place, and of course when the client is looking to take occupation of the building, and then an execution plan that wraps around that. Now, the one thing that I haven't mentioned here is feasibility studies. And the one thing I would say that's really important to understand in terms of stage 1 is the feasibility studies are just about testing, and it could be a simple block model in BIM, but it's just about testing that the brief and the spatial requirements sit on a site. Now, the example I like to give is I once was given a brief for a building in the city, and the site was 1,000 square meters, and we were asked for a single trading floor of 2,000 square meters. So obviously that was never going to work, but it's quite easy to look at a lot of these briefing discrepancies and to spend the first month of stage 2 trying to resolve them. So the feasibility studies are really just about making sure that the spatial requirements don't have any elements that need to be teased out? Do they fit on the site? Are there issues with the site because of its shape or because of the topography or any other thing? It's not really about doing the design. And certainly I've seen people doing feasibility studies before where they make recommendations for option 1 or option 2. That should definitely not take place at stage 1, because that's the second that you start to look at options and compare them, you're actually designing in that stage 2. So a really important thing to remember about stage 1. Next slide. And I think this is where really the topics that Dan's going to come on to become really important, because what we're seeing is that a lot of the topics that are driving change in the design process, so the shift to net zero or circular economy approaches, really are now beginning to go back and impact on how the client briefs for a building. So how does a client want to look at the whole challenge of developing a circular economy? How long does the building going to last, and so on and so forth. So there's a number of topics like this that are really changing the way we design. So we need to somehow push those back into the briefing process. Next slide. And another example here is, so buildings typically last, maybe 60 years, and we demolish and build and demolish and build. But of course, that is going to slowly change. Next slide, because we're going to see the trend in the future that we get buildings adapting over their life and buildings lasting longer. And of course, that in itself needs new briefing tools, and obviously will impact the way that a design comes together. Can we just click on the slide, please? So for example, maybe we need to fix things differently because nails and screws that we've typically used for thousands of years are not necessarily the best way of fitting elements into buildings that then can be subsequently renewed or taken out and replaced over the long term. So circular economy is going to drive a lot of changes in that briefing process and then obviously into the design process. Next slide. And similarly, we're seeing digital twins becoming really important. Now, whether that's digital twins or smart buildings, there's a whole bunch of briefing elements that are required. What data does the client want when a building's handed over? How is that data going to relate to smart sensors in the building, and so on and so forth? So a whole new layer of topics that need to play into the design and construction contracts, and obviously really need to be briefed at the outset of a building. Next slide. And similarly, if we just keep clicking through here, so the one of the main things here is that we're moving into a world of data. So we've been using documents and scale drawings as key deliverables and projects for centuries, actually. And we're now seeing the shift towards data that we want to connect into those digital twins that we just mentioned. So a shift towards the deliverables that are more data driven, and how we might actually start to connect data within the design process so that we can make real-time decisions rather than having time lags of days, if not weeks, between when data is circulated between parties. Next slide. And of course, we're now seeing a shift towards platforms, and this is a kit of parts that we are currently working on. Can we get the video to run? Yeah, I think it's just it's a bad connection. So here's a kit of parts that we're currently working on, which is really about trying to have reusable parts for a building. And again, that's a trend that needs to play back into the briefing process, because if we want a kit parts to be reusable over multiple projects, we then need to brief that. And similarly, this is looking at the future of robotics. We're all moving into the factory, and that's certainly a trend that we anticipate over the next 10, 20 years is we'll move slowly away from construction into manufacturing. And in that world of manufacturing, of course, we need to, if you like, reflect on the components that we use for construction, because perhaps those components that come from a wide range of people, from drywall contractors to, as you can see here, plumbing, plumbing suppliers and so on and forth, maybe those need to adapt to allow the productivity improvements that can be gained from manufacturing to take place. So, and of course, all of this is going to have an impact on how we brief and how we design throughout the course of a building. Next slide. And similarly, one of the things that we discovered recently, an example I always like to use, is it takes 150 decisions to design a staircase, and we tend to make those decisions intuitively on every single project. So a major shift into the future, and as we see things like decision engines, so everyone's talking about AI and ChatGPT in the last couple of months, so is really using AI and other tools to begin to unpack, well, what are the decisions that we make in projects? And in the world of net zero and manufacturing, how can we minimize those decisions so that we don't need to make them every time? Because obviously in this new complexity that we're seeing, the goal is to try and free up the time from the drudgery, if you like, to try and allow us to focus on the challenges of the future, which is responding to net zero and so on and so forth. So lots of different things that we'll see changing in that briefing through to design process. Next slide. And that then obviously brings us to stage 2. So stage 2 is really all about the architectural concept. Now, this was a change that we made in the 2020 iteration to really, make it absolutely clear that stage 2 is all about that architectural concept. But of course, an architectural concept can't exist in isolation. There needs to be some strategic engineering. We need to figure out that that concept design is achievable to the cost plan. We need some project strategies. We need a specification because that obviously impacts on the cost plan. And all of these things, need to come together. Now, what do we mean by strategic engineering? Well, that means things like grid sizes, the location and size of plant rooms, making sure the risers are in the right place. So it's not about the nitty gritty, but about the high level things. And the best way to look on this is anything that impacts on the architectural concept should really be in that strategic engineering. Similarly, project strategies, we don't necessarily need the nitty gritty, but things like, if we're building next to a railway line, maybe we need to have a very good view of the acoustic implications. Maybe if we have an atrium, we need to consider the fire strategy implications. So stage 2 is really not trying to do too much. It's trying to support the architectural concept with the right information rather than trying to bog things down with driving too deep into the actual design process. We also need to look at the project brief. Now, in the 2013 version, the project brief changed, but as has happened in most healthcare projects for many years, we now talk about derogation so that the brief remains static, and what stage 2 is about is highlighting areas where that brief may need to change for various reasons. And of course, stage 2 is absolutely crucial that we're having design reviews with the client on a regular basis and maybe with planners or other stakeholders. And of course, a design program is required to link all this stuff together so that lead designers setting out the cadence in the meetings and all the different topics that are being addressed by the design team. So that's stage 2. Next slide. And of course, when we look at the stages, I think for me, the design stages are really about stages 2 to 4. And the best way to look on stage 2 is it's moving from that first sketch that responds to the project brief right through to the optimum set of information at stage 4. Now, what's quite interesting is that I don't think anyone has ever done an exercise to determine what the optimal information would be at the end of stage 4. But really, that would be the minimum amount of information required to manufacture and design a building. Now, the other comment I want to make here, and we'll come on to this at stage 4, is stage 4 is all of the information required to manufacture and design a building. So it's information from the design team, all the specialists that come on board, and also the specialist subcontractors working for the contractor. So one of the things we tried to highlight in the 2020 plan of work was that all design is in stage 4. Stage 5 contains no design work whatsoever. But I'll come back to that when we get to stage 4 and stage 5. So it's really that whole period from the first sketch through to the optimum set of information. Next slide. Then stage 3, so now we've got the concept design signed off, so the client's relatively happy with what's happening. So now we need to go in a bit more detail. We need to do more detailed engineering analysis. So maybe we move from some rules of thumb for some of the structural design, for example, or the MEP into very detailed engineering analysis, the architect maybe has to start to do more detailed design studies for the facade or for the entrance. So the concept design doesn't change. It's just about layering in more detail to prove that that works, or to do the next level of design development. And the main goal at the end of stage 3 is that the scheme should be spatially coordinated. And that was one of the big topics that was discussed a lot in the development of the 2020 version. And the main reason is that, again, many years ago, it used to be that the same design team would work through stages 2, 3, and 4, but frequently now we hand the baton on to another design team. And of course, if the building has not been spatially coordinated at stage 3, then we potentially hand over issues to a design team that are not familiar with how the design is developed. So really important that the building is spatially coordinated at the end of stage 3. And of course, we've now got change control in place so that we can track where changes are made and the decisions around that. And of course, another design program. Next slide. And the other element where we made some tweaks in terms of 2020 is that the RIBA certainly recommends that a planning application is made at the end of stage 3. And one of the simple reasons is that we're finding that with net zero, more and more technical requirements need to be made with a planning application. And it's just simply not possible to do those using stage 2 information. But what we do recognize, if we just click again. Yeah, what we do recognize is that some clients will actually make a planning application earlier, because if I'm a private developer and I've purchased a site and I don't actually have planning consent, then obviously I maybe want to keep my investment as minimal as possible. So we certainly see a lot of developers that are doing projects day in, day out, trying to put their planning, well, not trying, putting their planning application in earlier than end of stage 3, but the RIBA's view is that does come with risks, because obviously the design is not spatially coordinated until the end of stage 3, and obviously going to a planning application earlier than the end of stage 3 does maybe reduce the design cost, but it comes with some risks which clients that are not used to doing buildings day in, day out that have got greater clarity that they will achieve consent may wish to take. So really important to understand the risks associated with submitting a planning application before the end of stage 3. Next slide. And of course, I already mentioned this, that the plan of work is agnostic to procurement. And of course, different procurement routes really engage the contractor earlier than others, obviously with a management contract or even a contractor-led route. The contractor is on board quite early, but of course, actual appointment date may be delayed until stage 4 when enough information has been produced. But the main action really in terms of in terms of information, is at stage 4, the work of the design team and the specialist subcontractors can be sliced and diced differently. So for example, on a traditional contract, a tender will go out with the design team's information, and any performance specified work by the contractor is not going to take place until a full appointment is in place with a contractor. Whereas on other routes, for example, 2-stage design and build, it's commonplace now to have a PCSA, so a pre-contract services agreement, where things like piling and maybe even the design of the facade with a specialist contractor will take place before the contractor is actually appointed. So really important to understand how stage 4 plays out differently to different procurement routes. The RIBA did debate this, the common occurrence of people referring to stage 3A plus and so on and so forth. But really stage 3A plus is about pulling information out of stage 4 to really inform that procurement route. And it's not really stage 3 at all. So really being cognizant of who's working at stage 4, well, I guess the key topics are: what are the design team doing, what's the contractor doing, what information is required from stage 4 to inform the procurement route. So those are the main considerations from a procurement perspective. Next slide. And of course, the other thing that we're trying to do at stage 4 is the manufacturing industry. The top bar in red has been leveraging really high productivity gains over the last 10 years or so. And whereas construction remains stubbornly flat in terms of the productivity improvement. So next slide. So one of the things that we're trying to do as an industry is move things to the factory. I'm not going to drill in the 7 categories of MMC on this call, but there are documents out there that define what these are. Next slide. And as we've already said, there's lots of different things happening. So obviously this will change from a standards perspective. This is maybe one of the areas that needs to get looked at, because defining how we're going to make a building is going to become a key requirement in the future. And of course, just now we predominantly issue information for construction, but as we'll see in a second, maybe the information that we need for the manufacturing process is slightly different. So next slide. And the other key thing that we were keen to play out at stage 4 is this whole notion of descriptive information versus prescriptive. So performance specifications were invented, if you like, 30 years ago, when we wanted to shift away from nominating a supplier to having suppliers make solutions to us. So some of the early curtain walling projects, a lot of these in London, the design team would issue a descriptive specification, and a lot of cladding contractors would come back with different solutions and creative ways of responding to that to provide the best solution visually that the architect was looking for, whilst at the same time responding to things like weather tightness or wind tightness and so on and so forth. But what we saw after the recession towards the end of the 1990s was that the whole descriptive prescriptive concept moved into lots more packages. So now it's quite common for the MEP, for example, to be issued as a descriptive specification, allowing the specialist subcontractor working for the contractor to specify equipment and giving them some leeway to actually look at some of the products as well. But it's really important to figure out when at stage 1 is what's going to be designed by the design team to be descriptive and what's going to be designed by the design team to be prescriptive. Ultimately, everything needs to be produced by the contractor to be prescriptive, but it's the roadmap of that journey that might vary from project to project. Next slide. And as I've already mentioned, we've even on the most complex of projects, we're still delivering scale drawings. We're increasingly issuing data. So PoW has been a fantastic initiative to start to standardize the data that we might issue to a contractor, and then the contractor onwards to the client for asset management purposes. Next slide. But we're certainly seeing a future that's very different around the information that'll be issued. We're looking at 4D solutions. We're seeing robots now coming to site and setting out. So, we no longer need to issue or dimension drawings, because the robot just needs a CAD file to print out the setting out on site, or we're looking at things like bill of materials. So we certainly anticipate that the role of standards in defining these new deliverables in the future will be quite important. Next slide. First, then we get onto stage 4, so that's where all of the different building systems, and one of the key reasons for having the building spatially coordinated at stage 3 is that when we get to stage 4, we really want to focus on the individual systems, the floor system, the ceiling, the roof systems, the partition systems, the mechanical system, the structural systems. And it's really important, and that, or rather not as important, it's more effective to work in these building systems when the building is actually in a steady state. So when that spatial coordination is in place, it certainly allows that to happen. And of course, depending on the procurement route, the design team might be working independently, but where the contractor has got an early appointment, stage 4 might have an integrated design program between the specialist subcontractors and the lead designer. So really important to realize that the design program is going to vary depending on the procurement route, but ultimately at the end of the day, at the end of stage 4 is all of the information by the design team and the specialist subcontractor, and as I said earlier on, the optimum information to manufacture and construct a building. Next slide. And then when we come to stage 5, so as I say, the important thing to realize is in a lot of situations, stage 4 and 5 will overlap, so they'll be concurrent, and hence the reason why a lot of people might say, well, the design work of the specialist subcontractors is stage 5, but it's actually stage 4 overlapping with stage 5. And for us, really, stage 5 is everything to do with the manufacturing construction. So obviously the contractor needs to do site logistics. A lot of contractors are now working with logistics contractors such as DHL or Wincanton to look at those logistics items, or they're using consolidation centers to make sure that components arrive on site on time. And of course, they're manufacturing and constructing all those different building systems. There needs to be a means of monitoring progress to make sure that the construction is happening on program. Someone needs to inspect construction quality. There will be queries from site. Now, this is, I guess, an interesting one, because technically a site query is in relation to stage 4 information. But I guess I suppose there's a benefit of doubt here that there's only so much that we can push into stage 4. So yes, those site queries need to be resolved, but technically speaking, that's kind of a stage 4 issue. And then of course we need to commission the building and hand over the building manual. Now, the building manual is a moving feast as well, because in the past we would traditionally have issued the last step of construction information from the design team. But now we might have point cloud surveys, and we've got a whole bunch of data to be issued, and including adding a lot of information from the specialist subcontractors into that kind of asset data that then gets pushed into an asset management or digital twin or smart building solution. Next slide. And then finally at stage 6, we've handed over the building, and now, I mean, I guess the stage 6 is really just concluding the building contract, which is typically a year after the building has been occupied. But I guess the main thing here is that we're doing some seasonal commissioning as part of that process. And the crucial thing from an RIBA perspective is that typically at the end of stage 6, the contractor and design team will disappear unless there's a latent defect arises. So the RIBA has been really keen to try and reinforce it's important to try and get that light touch post-occupancy evaluation, so that everyone that completes a project can take that information back into their next stage 1 process, and all the learning is available. And of course, the client will want different aftercare tasks as part of the post-occupancy, the soft landings process, where different things might happen, and sometimes that might go on for a 3-year period. Next slide. And of course, finally, I think a really great move with the RIBA plan of work is that we acknowledge that the client uses the building now, and really this is the client space, stage 7, really trying to look at how do I take all this data to manage the facility. And increasingly smart building technologies will be used to try and keep driving down that operational carbon. And I think we may see more commissions in the future for those involved in the design or operation of a building to try and get access to that post-occupancy data that's really crucial in driving out the carbon from all of our projects. But fundamentally, stage 7 at this point is about the client trying to learn how to drive out that carbon from their building. Next slide. And then the final piece is, bridging into Dan's presentation, is that I've already spoken about the horizontal taskbars of the RIBA plan of work. And if we just click, please. So the whole purpose of an overlay is really just, the whole purpose of an overlay is it's really just about providing another horizontal layer to the RIBA plan of work, but on a specialist topic. So the RIBA plan of work is obviously quite limited in what it can squeeze into a single A3 or A4 piece of paper. So RIBA has supported for a number of years the idea of an overlay, because what an overlay does is it allows more detailed content on what should be happening in relation to that topic. Each RIBA stage is stage 0, stage 1, and of course, more importantly, you'll see in the RIBA plan of work, there's a lot of bold terms there, like project strategies and so on. So an overlay might start to look at some of the topics relevant to that specific well, the topic that it's the overlays around. So next slide. So for example, recently there was a D4MA overlay published a few years ago, which has just been updated last year. So that sets out some of the core D4MA tasks. But you can see the whole point of an overlay is not to contradict the plan of work, it's to really allow that specialist topic to layer in more detail of what needs to be done at each RIBA stage, and to really anchor some of the thinking around that topic into the RIBA plan of work. Next slide. And the other one that has recently been announced, and I'm actually doing a presentation on Thursday, is the security overlay to the RIBA plan of work that looks at how to to create buildings with a more security conscious perspective. So that's the RIBA plan of work. I've set out the purpose of the overlays and shown you a couple of examples. So now I just want to hand back over to Dan to take you through the standard, an update on the standards overlay. So thank you very much.
That's brilliant. Thank you very much, Dale. And so what I'll do is I'll give a brief couple of minutes on effectively an announcement that we are working on an overlay with a standards component, and the idea is hopefully it's going to work exactly as Dale spoke about there. So this idea of this kind of horizontal taskbar that supports and extends onto the overlay itself. Now, one of the reasons for it is obviously as the UK's national standards body, we push to support standardization, and there are many ways that standards can help. And one of the points are that typically, unless cited in regulation, which few are, standards are by their very nature voluntary, and I typically refer to them as voluntary packets of convenience. This idea of you can either, go and measure how long people's legs are and how long their strides are, or you can do that amount of research for looking at all different kind of body types, or you can refer to the British standard with some standardized kind of stair heights and widths for those things. So they provide convenience in their documentation, and as such they do many things like ability to improve performance, manage and reduce risks, speed up innovation, which many people think standards mitigate around innovation, but help also build trust and demonstrate that sort of quality. So it's the idea of trying to push where there are good relevant standards and support their discovery. However, interestingly, in the way that I've spoken to many design practices out there, very few know about some of the standards that we offer. So for example, if I go talk about construction procurement, a key thing that's talked about in the construction playbook, trying to change the way that we procure more efficiently. And I think Dale had some points there about the way that procurement kind of fits into the overall plan of works. Almost no one is aware of some of the construction procurement standards that we have. So there's a discovery issue there and trying to bring those to the forefront so people can understand where they fit into the overall process. A standard I'm particularly fond of are space naming standards. When I worked in practice for Cardiff Council, our estates team were effectively, 2 doors down, and they named everything to the ISO space naming. It was something very dear to my heart, and it helped work those things in, particularly when we had lots of very old buildings that we would often go in, extend, revise. So a lot of the space naming was quite important, but yet many people don't know those exist. More specifically, from an architectural design point of view, there are standards on the sort of level of detail you would see in general arrangement and assembly drawings, something like ISO 7519. People aren't aware of that sort of standard. More broadly, standards on technical documents, again, same problem, you can't seem to have them. However, when it comes to something like 19650, there is awareness of those standards thanks to a lot of the effort that's gone into BIM level 2 and ultimately where we are now as part of the UK BIM framework. So some standards do make it over that threshold, but hopefully this is a way of supporting their discovery and at the same time benefiting people who read through it to understand where that good practice can fit into the way that people work. And the idea is, as part of producing this draft, it's been written effectively in 2 parts. The first is that a set of horizontal or kind of cross-stage standards where we have links and references to where collections can be found for things like related to the building regulations, things relating to things like CPR and potentially other regulations as things get developed. The family of standards around management systems, the old 9000, 14, 27, and those other multi-thousand standards that refer to things, the BIM standards I've mentioned, as well as a raft of standards around projects and procurement that actually focus more kind of horizontally on how these things are done properly, as opposed to specifically in construction and built environment. And then, as you'd probably expect more, this idea of stage-specific standards being referenced. And for example, Dale spoke there about the fact that within the planning works, some of the items are bolded out for specific deliverables or items or activities. And here's an example of a small bit of excerpt that we've started to work on, where as part of stage 0, looking at the business case, you can start to pull out some standards. And in this instance, you look at something like BS 6079, which is all about project management principles. It tells you, it doesn't tell you, it recommends the content of a business case. And you look at other standards like BS 8536, design for operability, and it actually has a schedule of questions that you should be able to answer with your business case. So being able to refer to these standards, it would help a client or someone acting on behalf of the client to produce that business case, hopefully in a quicker, more efficient and more standardized way, which means not only does it improve productivity, but it also helps with expectation for the recipient as well as for the author in the way that it's being produced. And ultimately, that is really all I wanted to talk about, so we can move on to the Q&A in a second. But what we've done is, as part of producing this standards overlay, we've produced an outline draft. We have gone through all the individual stages, looking at all the bold items and all the key activities within the RIBA plan of work, and I've started to outline what are the standards that connect to those. And I did note that there was a question that came in pre-submitted asking about non-British standards content, and the hope is that as we produce this, we will add in more content. So you might have just seen a British standard reference there in the slides, but other standardization can of course come in, which will factor into the other stages, such as when we establish a steering group of people who can look there and input additional information within there, so that we can actually fortify it with even more good content, as well as ensure that what's been written is valid in what it's trying to do. Ultimately develop that draft to the satisfaction of that steering group, which ultimately will lead to it being issued out for wider consultation, where hopefully all of you will have the opportunity to look at, comment, and provide thoughts and feelings on what's been produced, to ultimately then revise and publish this when we're able to. And obviously we, like we are in this presentation, as British Standards, are working alongside the RIBA on these steps to ultimately get this document produced. So please keep an eye on the communications between both BSI and the RIBA in terms of the way this is developing, as well as a lot of those other overlays and the way that things are being built up as we go into the future. So on that, what we'll do is we'll start answering some of the questions that have come through. So Dale, if you'd like to turn your camera on, and as I start to scan through some of the questions, we'll go through a couple of them. Now, one of the first ones that came in to the webinar today from Bob aligns quite well with one of the pre-submitted questions. So would you mind, Dale, telling everyone, it's a two-parter in a way, I guess part one is, how does fire safety fit into the current plan of works, as well as, are there any thoughts and feelings about a specific overlay to support building safety and all the regulatory reform that's happening at the moment?
Yeah, so obviously the RIBA's been following all the movements in the Building Safety Act for a number of years, but obviously the challenge has been waiting for all that to settle down, so that there was, if you like, a steady state for us to build on. So the RIBA has been looking at a building safety overlay to the RIBA plan of work for some time, and I believe that work is going to be starting very soon to try and get something published next year. But if you go to the current plan of work, it does talk about building regulations and the right timing for engaging with those. So there is some of the raw content in there already done.
No, brilliant, thank you. We have got, it appears overlays are a popular topic, because we have people suggesting topics for future overlays, or if there are ones that exist. So two different individuals, Raymond and Paul, are asking about overlays around MEP services. Now, interestingly, if I remember, do the iTruckD have a specific overlay? I think, don't they? Or
Well, it's BISRIA, yeah. So BG6 obviously exists and relates to the RIB plan of work. So it sets out what happens at each stage for the building services. So I think that's already there. I believe that's currently being looked at just now. I'm not sure what developments are doing, but certainly if you use BG6, it's aligned to the RIB plan of work.
no, perfect. So then, so in theory, then the RIBA would stay away, would work with BISRIA as opposed to developing an overlay themselves there. That's
Correct,
perfect.
correct. And same, I think iStruct's got a structural overlay as well, Dan. But again, that was commented on by the RIBA.
No, that is brilliant. Thank you. We've got a question around, it sort of relates to the building safety stuff, again, about content to support the golden thread. So
Yeah.
I guess the question is now, say we wanted to update either some of the overlays or the plan of work proper, how would you see those sorts of things fitting in over the next couple of years?
Yeah, so I think a lot of the golden thread is just about information continuity. So I think there is probably an exercise to be done on what deliverables might be, well, should be coming out at each stage. Because even if I look at a traditional project, there isn't actually a set of standard deliverables that exists that should be used on projects. Those tend to come from project managers or clients that have their own documents. So I think a good move would be to look at an industry-wide set of deliverables and how we, like I mentioned in my presentation, how we begin to shift away from drawings and documents into data. Because obviously, if I'm going to issue data, I mean, it's interesting because I find that PoW is a fantastic schema, but what I frequently don't see in contracts is who's actually going to issue, who's contractually required to issue that data and at what stage. It's certainly ambiguous in the PoW template, and a lot of the template, well, if you like, the completed templates that we get through actually don't really clarify some of that. And of course, we're looking for even greater rollout of data in the future. So I think data deliverables is probably a fairly major topic that's going to come up in the future, and of course that directly layers straight into the Building Safety Act because we want to know who's defined what data at what stage.
No, that's brilliant. Thank you. A few questions have come in really around that data side from Bryn. A few multi-part ones, but I guess the main crux first is that relationship with data. Obviously, things like 19650 quickly come into that conversation.
Yeah.
And I guess questions are, will we see further detail around things like where the organizational information requirements, asset information, the OIR, AIR, PIR sort of things,
Yeah.
will we see those being more clarified more clearly in a future RIBA plan of work or digital overlay? And there's also some questions around some of the terminology. And I think one of the examples was, it says BIM execution plan in the standards, but digital execution plan in the plan of works. So do you have any detail about those?
Yeah, so I guess we put digital execution plan into the plan of work because we were preempting that we are shifting beyond just BIM. We're looking at digital solutions. I mean, data can be done in isolation to a BIM model. So yeah, we definitely see a lot of trends. I think one of the challenges, Dan, is things are moving so fast now. I mean, last year, it's interesting, we were talking about the metaverse and NFTs, and we don't talk about that anymore. But all the chat is around, well, chat GPT and so on. So things are moving super fast. And I think one of the challenges, certainly we've spoken about before, is how do we keep standards up to date and relevant to such a fast moving landscape? But like I say, I think the main thing is just trying to get that data conversation going because data's all over the place. I mean, if you look at law, for example, a lot of the law AI initiatives are all around scanning documents and then having AI tools use that. But if you think about us, the data's all over the place. We've got data that comes out of simulations. We've got data that comes out of analysis software. We've got data that comes out of models. So there are so many different types of information types in the construction industry. Well, 4D models, 5D models. I mean, I could go on and on. So I think one of the first things, as we try to move from taking data and pushing it into documents, is, well, what is the data that's underpinning some of the software, and how might we push that in from one piece of software into another? So I think it's a really huge conversation, Dan, but I think one that's really crucial to the future, because as I mentioned, the design process is changing. We're shifting into manufacturing. So trying to look at traditional project processes and how those play to manufacturing content is going to be really crucial. But I could probably take an hour in itself just answering that question. But yes, I think that's going to be one of the biggest topics of this decade, is making that transition, not just from our BIM models, but into all the things that wrap around the design process, and how do we then start to define that in contracts in a way that we can allow all of that to really flow really fast between the different parties involved in the design process.
No, that's fab. Thank you. I can see some of the questions have suggested standards for including in the overlay, which is great. Thank you for that. For example, I think Paul's recommended we check that 44,000, which is collaborative business relationships, is put in there. So yes, that's the exact sort of thing we're looking for. An interesting one I can see here are suggestions for other overlays. One is potentially an overlay for refurbishment and retrofit from Christina. I guess with things like PoW 2035 and a lot of that, I guess that's quite a hot topic. So I can imagine, we'll wait and see what happens there, but I can't see why not really, because there's lots of interesting things happening in the sustainability space.
Yeah, and that's a good point. I mean, maybe that overlay is actually a circular economy overlay, because adaptive buildings and retrofit will increasingly become part of that circular economy process. So, but yeah, these are all great ideas, and yeah, no, the RIBA is more than welcome to take all these ideas, because, like I said, is overlays are a really good way to support and underpin the plan of work, but bring clarity and onto a topic that's nascent or one that's becoming really important as we move to new ways of doing things.
No, that's great. Thank you. And I'll have one last question, and then I think we'll have to start to wrap up. And I guess the question is about what happens to the overlays, I guess, in the future if the main plan of work is revised. So, I mean, I would guess, are they all looked at and considered for incorporation into like part of these parts of it into the main body, or what's the interaction there? Say, I'm not saying you are working on it, but if you're working on a PoW 2025 or something, what happens to the overlays then?
So I think the main thing is, I think we've got a lot of clarity now in the stages, and I think that international mapping that we did has been quite crucial in just really cementing that I think the stages are quite robust and will stick into the future. One of the challenges, one of the past, so for example, we wrote the BIM overlay to the RIBA plan of work, but that was the old plan of work, and we've never updated that. So, but I think now that there's the stages are static, I think we can afford to have that time lag, because let's say the plan of work is fairly stable just now, and so any overlay should be robust into the future. RIB is certainly not proposing any major changes to the stages at this point in time or into the future, so it should be robust enough for people to write overlays and those to be robust. Hopefully for many a year to come, Dan.
Well, let's hope so. No, that's brilliant. Thank you very much, Dale. So if we, I think, chuck on the screen quickly. And so I think we all want to thank Dale for his time. So thank you very much for coming and talking in such great length about the plan of works and their overlays and supporting this idea of a standards overlay between us all. So I will leave you there, fellow, while I just let everyone know about some of our future events. So I think that's all been very interesting, and you can see on the screen now a lot of the events that we have coming up. So obviously on the subject of retrofit and refurbishment, we've got a specific webinar on PAS 2030 and 2035 on the 31st of October, as soon as 2 o'clock this afternoon, so in an hour's time. We have an interesting one there on fire engineering through the gateways, focusing on building safety. Next week, I have the joy of having a half day focusing on the built environment and what's happening effectively in the 10 years since PAS 1192 Part 2 was published. So looking at what's happened in the last 10 years, what's happening now, what's happening for the future, as well as a raft of other events that you can see there. So as mentioned at the start, we have on-demand webinars, so you can look at some of our past ones. Do take a note of some of the dates there for some of our future webinars that are going forwards. Otherwise, I hope that you've enjoyed listening to this webinar or come to future events, and hope that you have a lovely rest of the day. But that's me signing off. So thank you for joining, and hope to see you all soon. Thank you.